Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Exploring Fiction. My name is Russell A. Wells, and today we do have a very special video. I do have a guest, fellow author and YouTuber, the indie writer Franklin Roberts. So, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
So I am a big fan. I did, like I said before we were starting this recording here, I found you through the YouTube algorithm on your videos about Elric. But when I heard the description of your book, The Wizard Slayer, I was immediately intrigued, and I went out right away and I got myself a copy, and I was very pleased with the result. So I'm glad to report that I thoroughly enjoyed that book.
Thank you. That means a lot.
So the first question I wanted to ask you here is just maybe can you give a brief description of the Wizard Slayer and just the story in general? I haven't read the second one yet, but so maybe light on the spoilers, I guess, just for an audience that might be unfamiliar with your
Yeah.
work so far.
The Wizard Slayer, the titular character of the book, is a barbarian, but a monster of a barbarian, not your typical Conan type hero. He's a Kolgathian. So, coming from a race of humans that have been isolated for so long, they've started to evolve more towards the monstrous end of things. He's 7 feet tall, fangs more akin to the wolf, and for reasons you may find out at one point, he has a hatred of all things magic. And part of what, at least I tried to have make Wizard Slayer set apart from most other fantasy, is that all magic is evil. It's not just a different form of science in the world. It's more akin to the old-fashioned idea that magic is appealing to darker entities in order to give you power. And so the Wizard Slayer revolves around his adventures of slaying wizards, but there's a little more to it than that. There's another character, Elidith Kaladine, a good, young, virtuous swordsman who is born into a dark fate, and he has to contend with that as well as get along with a barbarian that's intent on killing all magic.
Right, right. So that was one thing I did notice right away was I liked the take on the magic being evil and kind of going back to that because that was I recently started reading Robert E. Howard now and he's now one of my favorite writers.
Mm,
So seeing that
good.
again because magic has especially recently been a lot of it's been either more akin to a science or always used for good. So seeing it again be brought back as kind of this evil thing to be fighting against was definitely a cool trope to bring back. So I enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah, you see that a lot in the older sword and
Mm-hmm.
sorcery stories where you have the hero who you can empathize with because he's got nothing but his own muscles and steel, but the enemies have the on the one hand that evil, prideful intellect, as well as that power that they really is above their pay grade. They really can't control it. At least, well, they can control it, but it's a twisting of reality, and reality usually snaps back if you try to manipulate things too much for your own ends.
Right. They usually kind of cycles out of control.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I guess moving along then, just talking about your writing in general. When did you first get into writing, and why? I mean, this is obviously kind of a universal question, but it also everyone's story differs. So I was just wondering, for you personally, what's kind of your story into getting into that?
Well, I went to college at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh for radio, TV, film of all things. So my skill set is wild. I do a lot of stuff on the video side. For a time, I ran a show on the university where we grabbed local bands and had them perform an in studio concert, and I got to direct that, which was a really cool experience. But I also did a lot of script writing, and I think script writing is a really good start because with scripts, it's a very dense medium. You have to do a lot in a very short amount of pages. One of the golden rules of script writing is that by 10 pages, things need to be moving, it needs to be going somewhere. And so, moving out from that, kind of on my own time, I kind of just wanted to write, I guess, for funsies. The Wizard Slayer started as just a goofy little story I might show my friends, and then it's obviously spiraled out of control, and now I'm here about to publish my third book in the Wizard Slayer saga.
Right, and I actually did just see, I believe, on your recent mailing list update that cover. So that w-
Yes.
I was gonna say, I believe that was on that most recent mailing list update. So, and I noticed when I was reading that it was also going to be the end of Eldritch story. Is that correct? At least within the
Yeah.
main saga there.
Yeah, so what I can't stand is a story that doesn't have an end, right? Because it's kind of like a joke without a punchline, and you really need to bring things to a close. And part of the problem, I'll say, with indie books, or at least the indie industry, is that the more books in a series, the more money an author can make. But that means that satisfying end, the tying up of all things, is constantly being pushed back. And while I am planning to continue the Wizard Slayer saga past book three, I've actually already started on four. I'm a few chapters in, but I want to fulfill my promise to the reader by giving things kind of a solid conclusion.
Right, right, and especially I have seen that a lot with a lot of indie writers because that is the ticket to I guess making money is keeping the series going because once you get someone in on the first book and then it just keeps on going, that's just your stream of revenue there, which is that's one strategy. But I would definitely agree, and not to take it on a tangent, but I do think also with a lot of modern stories, especially coming from Hollywood too, they're not letting a lot of franchises that should have a definitive ending stay stay ended. They're bringing every a lot of things, a lot of characters back, and I don't know. I just
Yeah,
not as big a fan of that because some things I think they came to an end at a specific point, and that there's bringing it back feels cheap, I guess.
yeah, it's kind of like the sad fact of like a creative endeavor. Making something good is difficult, but like once you have that good product, unfortunately, you kind of like there's a temptation to milk it as much as possible, and too many franchises are in that milking stage. I think like Star Wars, it's unfortunately on its last legs. Marvel is struggling, and it's kind of sad to see because at least with in Marvel, like Iron Man, the character, he had a good triumphant end,
Right, right.
but like for all these other characters, it's kind of sad.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely is. It's when you get to the point of being apathetic towards a lot of it, that's what makes it kind of sad. Looking back at a couple years ago, being very excited for all the next entries into whatever series it is, and
Yeah,
now it's yeah. But okay, so the next thing I definitely wanted to ask you about your work. How long did that first Wizard Slayer book take to develop from the initial idea to publication? And then if you could just talk more about kind of that what your daily process was like. Like I know for me, when I always sit down to do any sort of fiction writing, it's always 1,000 words a day, no matter if I'm feeling inspired or not, because I just know that if you reach the end, you can always go back and edit, but if you're only
yes,
writing when you're inspired, then it's hard to get to that ending point.
definitely. Well, the inspiration happened, man, ages ago, and it kind of dwelled in my mind for a while. I went back and forth, and I can't remember how many months, just not even like the setting or the characters, but just the concept of the Wizard Slayer kind of like sat in my mind, developing itself. But I think from the first page of the book until when I hit publish was, I think, 9 months. But it's kind of tricky because I actually started I really thought it wasn't going to turn out into a book series, and I started writing short stories, and I have a folder of a bunch of short stories before the book takes place. That kind of happened. I wanted to be kind of a little episodic thing, much like Conan or any other old sword and sorcery hero. It started as stories, and then I had an idea for a complex story, more complex, and I figured, yeah, this will be, 20,000 words probably, which is about twice as long as a solid long short story should be. And then I got to, what was it, 30,000 words, and I was a sixth of a way through the story. So it turns out it was way more complicated than I thought it was
Right.
going to be. So, yeah.
So were you? Did you sit down and like attack it like 1,000 words at a time every day? And did when you were first coming up with the story, did you write out the full outline beforehand, or and then it just kind of got bigger the more you realized that it was, I don't know, just a bigger story?
Yeah, I struggled to get 1,000 words a day initially. I have terrible focus. I was always the kid who would be finishing the last sentences of his essay minutes before the deadline. So it definitely was a brutal process. I remember when I was first writing the book, 500 words a day was like my goal. And then that grew to 1,000, and I struggled with that throughout the first book. But then by the time, well, now it's like 2,000 words is nothing. Like I just sit down and I can do that in about 3.5 solid focused hours now.
Hmm.
But initially, I never wrote out the plan. I'm not a notes person either. Um, I I did have to kind of write out the scene structure and how like things flowed and kind of came to pass, just so that there weren't any inconsistencies in what happened before when. But I think it was Stephen King who once said that like notes are where bad ideas live for too long, because
Mm-hmm.
if it's a good idea, it's gonna stay in your head and it's gonna stick with you until you get it out on paper. But notes, it's like the process of writing notes for me is more important than actually looking back at the notes, because once I've written it down, it's like that's the idea, that's there. But not to say that you shouldn't plan out what you're about to do, because my writing slows and gets worse whenever I veer away from my central plan. So I kind of come at it from understanding the structure as a whole and with the end in mind. That's how I go forward.
Okay, that's very interesting. I don't think I've ever heard that Stephen King quote before, but
I hope you
that's
said that.
yeah, yeah. But um yeah, no, that's interesting because I differ a little bit. I know when I'm outlining, I'm a big bullet pointed list person, and then I don't know, I try and keep them more vague and broad bullet points, and then they always somehow get more detailed as I create the outline. But I do like that idea that if the idea sticks in your head, then that's definitely probably a good idea, because I definitely know that when I've done a lot of writing projects, um, that yes, when I make a list of notes or characters or something, usually it's stuff that I can probably get rid of, that weren't the greatest ideas, but I care about the ideas too much, and so I can definitely see getting lost in the notes and the outlining process, for sure.
Yeah, it was when I was in a script writing class, one of the kind of things they had us do was before we started, you did have to make a detailed outline, and during the drafting process, I kind of veered away from it. It wasn't really a thing that helped me, but we also had to make like character profiles for all the major characters, and that was weird to me because it always felt super artificial, because
Hmm.
the way the character manifests in the manuscript is who they are, despite what you're trying to make them. So, for me, the center of a character is their values, right? Because personality changes by the context, and
Right.
their appearance, changes based on what they're wearing.
Right.
But everything stems from values, and that's really where their deepest self is at. So, with that in mind, that's I that's what I have in my head as I'm writing what the character is doing.
Hmm. Yeah, I've never been a fan of like character profiles. That was never something that appealed to me, and I don't know, after the main character, there was never enough to for me to put down on the page because kind of like you're saying, I was would care about kind of what they stood for, and then everything kind of worked from the ground up from there. So I would definitely agree with that.
Hmm.
So after you were done with that first draft of the first book, um, I know because the indie publishing space is kind of not notorious, but there are a lot of ways to, since you're doing everything yourself, it's easy to get lost in the editing and the publication process with finding editors, finding book covers. So was that difficult for you, or did you have connections or knowledge that led the editing and publication process to being easier than the than some other indie authors who are just starting?
Um, it is definitely a difficult and brutal process, but I think the best way to go about it is to just dive in and figure it out as you go. You're gonna make mistakes. I've made mistakes, but after two books now, like I've made enough mistakes and learned from them,
Hmm.
so that the process of doing book three now is gotten a lot better, obviously, and then that just builds up my own skill set. So instead of having to pay for some outside person to do it, I can just do it myself. And when you have that skill set yourself, you maintain all that creative freedom, and it things will go along at your own pace. Because I know for the first two books, I hired a professional cover company to do it,
Hmm.
and I'm happy that I did that because they did a great job. And covers are your number one marketing asset,
Right.
but with books three onward, it's I'm doing so much image marketing now that I might as
Mm-hmm.
well just dive into it, learn Photoshop, and so I worked through it ground up. I had the YouTube tutorial tab on one monitor, the Photoshop on another, and I trial and error, emphasis on error. I
Right.
got something out
Right.
of it. So
Right. Yeah, well, that is a an easy trap to fall into. I notice for a lot of indie writers is the not knowing what you're doing and overpaying, but also I have in my own experience also seen that yeah, it's just a lot of that trial and error and just learning as you go. So I definitely am happy to hear you say that.
I think another thing indie authors really need to be careful of is there's like the indie author industry, we'll say,
Hmm.
but then there's also like the author scam industry, which is
Right, right.
terrifyingly large.
The
I mean,
people who the
most of
people
my
who make
emails,
more money writing books about how to write books than actually writing
yeah,
books.
yeah. Whenever I look up a book on marketing or writing books or anything, if the author also has a fiction series, I make sure to see if that's actually selling well before
Right.
reading what they have to say. But no, the vast majority of the emails I get on my website are scammers trying to, oh, we'll promote your book for you, and
Hmm.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah. So I know you were talking about it took you a while to kind of get into. You were starting at 500 words a day on the first book. Um, were there any big lessons or things you learned doing that first book that have kind of not exactly expedited the process, but kind of made it easier to when writing the second and now the third one?
well, good old fashioned practice. That's one thing. Whoops, that was my headphone. Good old fashioned practice is obviously pays off, but kind of learning your own uh, personal quirks and what kind of gets your brain to flow more. So originally, I would be just writing at the kitchen table, but there's something about the old trope of like the coffee shop author
Hmm.
being out in a clean public space that kind of like keeps you focused because if everyone's seeing me, I better look productive, and that gets you to be productive.
Right.
Uh, and having that separate space of where you work really helps as well. And then from there, kind of figuring out just little things like just kind of like what background music you listen to. Like the focus music 10-hour loop or whatever on YouTube is helpful. But for me, I actually I'm a huge metalhead. I like metal, and there's a huge subgenre of like underground sword and sorcery based metal.
Hmm.
Like think bands like Eternal Champion, Visigoth, Gatekeeper, I think it is, that haven't hit it big. Like you can't, no one will know who you're talking about if you mention it in casual conversation.
Right.
But it's just that kind of stuff that really gets things flowing. That I found I like listening to them, and that just gets me in the proper headspace when I write.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to write some of those down and give it a try because I'm slowly getting into metal. Like it's slowly happening. Like we're starting off easy, you know, Metallica,
Yeah, it's a very
and then Five Finger Death
diverse
Punch and
genre.
Sabaton, and then we're slowly
Mm.
making the way. So so now I just want to talk about well some of the ideas I enjoyed from the Wizard Slayer personally. One thing that stuck out to me, I don't know if you had any sort of specific inspiration or idea from this, but was how you portrayed the dwarves as like the
Mm.
cannibalistic hive mind uh, species, because that's so different from a lot of other works that I don't know. I just found that really interesting. Was there anything specific behind that, or
Well, when you're getting creative with your setting, originality doesn't necessarily make it good, right?
right,
Like there's random, you know, world generators galore online and stuff, and that doesn't give you anything good. Everything that you do in your setting has to stem from the themes of the work, right? And the world of the Wizard Slayer is a world that's falling apart in disrepair. And so typically, the dwarves are the tradition bound, wholesome miners with beards and stuff. And I kind of took that to the nth degree. As they're just isolated for so long, they turn into these savage monsters. And they're also heavily inspired by Worms of the Earth by Robert E. Howard. That's a short story I'd highly recommend, where the Pictish king Branmak Morn has to raise this army of degenerate Lovecraftian monsters from the depths of the earth in order to take vengeance on the Romans. So I kind of took a hint of that and then played around with dwarves a little bit to get what essentially fills the fantasy niche of goblins, but in a
right,
newer way.
right. Well, that's I don't think that's a Robert E. Howard story I've read yet. I'm making my way through Solomon Kane now, but
Ooh, good stories.
yeah,
I love that character because he's unapologetic about him just being a justice oriented, adventure loving guy. And I think I want to say, I can't remember which story it is, but he sails across continents chasing down one guy who took advantage and killed this girl. And he asked Kane, like, why are you doing this? And Kane's like, justice. Like,
right.
and that's all the explanation you need. It's awesome,
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, and especially, coming from me, my channel is mainly oriented toward A Song of Ice and Fire, but to be honest, I there's just something about the heroes who are good just to be good that appeals to me also. So, um,
Yeah, I think it appeals to a lot of people because the heroes, good heroes, are people you strive to emulate, right? Now, they
right.
all have their quirks and stuff, but I've had a hard time getting into A Song of Ice and Fire personally. One, because I'm not a huge fan of series without an end. And as
Right.
far as I can tell, Winds of Winter won't be coming out. And
No, I
I
would
was
tend to agree.
yeah,
So,
even when I was watching House of the Dragon, I was just waiting for the point when one of the characters would kind of ride his dragon and have adventures and fight for something good instead of a bunch of self-serving politicians bickering. I mean
right.
that reduces it a little bit, but it didn't resonate with me because of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. It's very interesting to a point reading about all the basically characters who all have the inclination for evil, I guess, and good never gets rewarded in A Song of Ice and Fire. Basically, never.
Yeah, well, I mean, everyone is evil within them and a great potential for evil. So there's something to be said about that kind of work. But the best characters overcome that.
Right, right. Instead of just falling back into it. Exactly.
Yes.
So, would you say you prefer then the characters who are kind of aspirational and good in nature, or because I have a Song of Ice and Fire focused channel, you know, a lot of my subscribers are into the very notoriously morally gray quote unquote characters. Do you have a sort of character archetype or something like that, you know, on the scale of morality that you prefer to read?
It's uh you need that element of darkness in a good character. Take Batman for example, right? He dresses up like a monster to go out at night and beat people up, you know? And it's I think the classic knight in shining armor is cool and all, but it's lacking that, you know, human nature of evil in him.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the best morally gray characters are the one who kind of harness the shadow of their own psyche and put it towards good and struggle to put it towards good, because that the struggle against the evil in yourself is with everyone, right? And the characters that can overcome that and then still aspire to good, that's a really good character.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would definitely agree there.
I think yeah, because I looking back on all the characters I like Elric from the Elric saga,
Mm-hmm.
you know, he's objectively very evil, coming from a very evil society, but there's spoiler alert for a book that came out like what 40 years ago now. At the end of the Fortress of the Pearl, he he wreaks vengeance on this evil decadent society, much like the one that he came from. And while he does go overboard a little bit, there is that kind of satisfying element to it because he's taken his the evil side, driven by Stormbringer, and making sort of good out of it. And I think that's what makes an interesting story is that whole contention there.
Right, right. I would definitely agree. I don't know. There's something to be said just about the classic good and evil, but also then when you see that kind of internally and the back and forth that way,
Mm-hmm.
I would definitely agree.
Yeah, and even like the classical stories, like Lord of the Rings. A lot of people think that's white and black morality, but it's really black and gray morality
Mm-hmm.
because the ring tempts everyone. Even Frodo, at the end, fails and falls to the temptation of the ring, and it's only because of evil, self-destructive nature that Gollum bites off his finger and falls into the fires of Mount Doom.
Right,
So
right,
I think
exactly.
that's always been there in the best of stories.
Mm-hmm. Even in the pinnacle of fantasy, you that like you were just saying, you see that that the main character fails in the end and falls to that temptation. As far as your main character Krail, I will say I liked all the in the first book the hints to his backstory as well, but this is kind of a pivot from what we were talking about before. But I'm kind of glad that we didn't dive into it anymore, and I don't know about the second book obviously because that's still on the shelf there. I'm going to read that soon, but do you have any plans to explore any more of his backstory? Because personally, I think leaving it more mysterious, I kind of like, but I was wondering if you had any plans in that direction.
Well, funny you should say that because I do explore his backstory.
Is it in the
It's
second one?
yes, but
Okay.
it's you have to be careful about doing that, you know, because you need that element of mysteriousness in a character. And when I do dive into his backstory, it's small little glimpses, if that makes sense.
Right, right. That
'Cause
does make sense. Yep. I was just thinking, like one of my favorite characters in kind of in fiction in general is Clint Eastwood, Man with No Name from the Dollars trilogy.
Not familiar with that.
Okay, the Fistful of Dollars for a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Um, but
Oh, okay. I've seen Good, Bad, and the
yeah,
Ugly.
yeah, but I just like Clint Eastwood's character because he's in every movie he has a different name, and he's the same character but also not the same character, but he's also almost a side character in his own movies because they don't really explore every aspect of his background. He's just kind of there, and he is an anti-hero, but you don't get a thorough explanation of who he is, but he's just kind of almost this primordial force that drives the story.
Yeah. I actually, you could say I took a similar approach to Krail in the first Wizard Slayer book, because he's kind of at like the pinnacle of who he is. He's a real paragon. Like few wizards can stand against him. So instead of explaining who he is from the outright, it's a lot of it's of people's reactions to him. And in the first book, he's only really in like half the chapters.
Right,
But
right.
as the story focuses more on him, then I delve more into his backstory as well as what's going on within his own head.
Hmm.
I'm not totally, just like removing the curtain and explaining everything outright, because that's just not satisfying.
Yeah.
But giving you glimpses into who he is, just so that you can really know what's going on when his psyche is put to the test.
Hmm. Like I remember one of my favorite chapters might have been that the one with him in the pit with all the snakes in the dark. That one might have been my personal favorite.
Yeah, the trial of the pit and the candle, for those of
Hmm.
you that haven't
Right.
read it yet, is the monks of Mogmatar chained up Krail, who was a slave at the time, and dropped him into a dark pit filled with snakes for 3 days. And while the snakes couldn't kill him because of a handful of antivenoms and other stuff, um, psychologically that could destroy you. And so they gave him just a single candle of light to focus on. And then at the end of the second day, the light goes out, and he has nothing except the memory of that light to focus on. And that focus, that absolute tempering of the will, is what gives him his resistance to all the temptations and enchantments of magic.
Yeah, that's a very intense but well done in internal character challenge there. I loved how that was done.
Oh, it would have been a lot easier just to give him this superpower of, oh yeah, if he's a mutant or whatever, magic just somehow doesn't affect him. But I think that would take away too much humanity from the character. So it's not an ability he has. It's something that he had to overcome that renders all these other temptations just something he can push aside.
Right, right. So I know you said earlier that the Wizard Slayer kind of evolved from a bunch of short stories you had written, and I know you have one short story that's out. Are any of those other short stories that you were developing originally ever going to make it out there, or are they going to develop into maybe longer stories, or do you have a plan for those?
So quite a few of the original stories I kind of took apart and recycled sort of and put into the book, just because they're quite good and they fit that greater narrative that I was going at.
Hmm.
But I do have one that is needs to undergo a lot of polishing, but I'll have that out at some point. I have another one that's on deck as well, and those are actually taking place during like the glory days of the Wizard Slayer's career.
Okay.
Because at the start of the first book, that's like he's at his pinnacle. So the other books will be kind of, or stories I should say, will be taking place before that.
Hmm. Okay. Well, that'll be interesting. So the next thing I kind of wanted to just talk about, just I thought it would be interesting to see was maybe you could list a couple of your top authors or books, not just that provided inspiration for you, but just in general, maybe some of your all time favorites.
All-time favorites. Since childhood, J.R.R. Tolkien. Obviously, he's the grandfather of like modern fantasy as we know it. But he was also just really smart with folklore and the ancient stories, and he really understood why they worked. So when he went his made his own work, that just made it all the more powerful. And his Catholic philosophy that is present throughout the entire story is just makes that whole legendarium shine. But in addition to that, Robert E. Howard is obviously highly inspirational. Um, his approach to the whole like barbarism versus civilization thing, I think at least resonated with me, and just the powerful character of Conan going up against things way above his pay grade and still coming out victorious, I thought was awesome. I also liked that prehistoric sort of setting too. I think a lot of modern fantasy is feels modern because it has modern sensibilities, but you know, in the olden days, that wasn't necessarily the case. Not to say that modern sensibilities and morality is bad. It's just that if you want, that those good things to shine, if you have a world where that isn't necessarily the case, and then characters fight for that, that works better. So like in Krill fights against like slave traders and traffickers and stuff because like there's slavery in the world. Slavery is bad, obviously, but fighting against that lets that virtue shine in a way where a slave-free world would just seem to pander to modern readers. I think, in a sense. Um,
Right.
I like a lot of other older um, uh, sword and sorcery. Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. That's classic. Michael Moorcock is awesome. Obviously, he gets really wild, so you have to be ready for it. But that's always a good thing to dive into. Um, Lately, I've been reading Brian Lumley's I think it's Terra Cash short stories. They came out in the '90s, but they do have that old-fashioned sword and sorcery feel. Those are huge inspirations, but also I'm a huge anime fan too. So Berserk is great. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is very bizarre, but just the way he builds up tension in every fight is beautiful. Because despite all the crazy things that are going on, the way you build tension is how you keep people on the edge of your seat for things. And then Vinland Saga as well is an anime I'd highly recommend.
Okay. And yeah, keeping on that point about fight scenes too, that was always one piece of advice that didn't spawn from any one person, I don't think, but I always found it really interesting that you hear from a lot of seasoned writers that with fight scenes, it's more about the tension than it is about the actual fighting. So,
Yeah, I was writing a script about this was a crazy idea. It was a post-apocalyptic world where all guns have been outlawed, so all the criminal gangs turned into sword-wielding clans, and I had this really cool fight scene set up. And the professor of that class at the time, he said, "You do martial arts, you know what you're talking about when you write a fight, so you can describe it as much as you want." And I had this giant paragraph of technical, he punched here and he grabbed here,
right.
and then I read through it once and instantly deleted it because it was garbage. It would have looked really cool, but to a person reading it, it doesn't mean anything, you know? It's,
Right.
it's really about the tension that goes into it.
Yeah, and so I definitely think that I know personally for me, Tolkien is definitely a big inspiration. Obviously, Lord of the Rings, and a lot of the kind of works that spawned out of that or kind of took inspiration from that. But also, I do agree that some of the weirder aspects of fantasy, those are always a lot of fun. I know one thing I love is the Elder Scrolls lore. Like I like the games, I like the games,
Yeah.
but the lore is just so wacky that uh, I don't know, I can't help but love it. Like that's part of the inspiration for my channel too, was some of those Elder Scrolls lore channels and the way they kind of constructed um, informational videos, but in a narrative sort of way. But that is one world for me personally that um, is always fun to think about.
Yeah, and I think the Elder Scrolls lore peaked around Morrowind
Oh, I agree. I
because that
agree.
was when they Arena and Daggerfall were fairly standard fantasy, but with Michael Kirkbride's just crazy writing, it
Right.
took it to a
It's
whole
so
new
fun to
level
read.
where it
So
was
it's so
manageable.
weird,
Yeah,
but
and that weirdness is cool to dive into, you know. But then unfortunately, with Oblivion, they kind of vanillaed it out
exactly,
a little too
exactly,
much.
exactly. Like it was a fun game still, but Morrowind was so um, so weird in a great way. It was just something so different that I don't know that
Yeah,
just so
it
interesting.
was different, but it still played to all the fantasy tropes. You know, there were
Right,
still
right,
wizarding guilds and fighting against demons and stuff and all that, but it definitely in a new way.
right. So I guess now to pivot one more time, I know that you have your mailing list and you have a couple of YouTube videos. What has been your most effective marketing tool? Because I know you're on Facebook as well, is where you provide some of your updates. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Facebook ads for me are kind of like my main thing, and then I I've switched up my daytime work schedule now to kind of account for all the extra marketing I'm going to be doing. But yeah, the Facebook ads are kind of my main thing, and then book promotional websites to give it a boost whenever I do a sale, and then Amazon ads as well. That's how I do most of my marketing. I did YouTube for a little while. The problem with that is it's really labor intensive. I To get a good 10-minute video script for me is 2,000 words, so that's like a good day of writing. But then having to read it off and film and edit and all that, it's while I love doing it and I want to get into it in the future soon, it's just not enough time for it.
Yeah. Okay, I understand. And that actually leads right into what I wanted to talk about because I wanted to say, I personally thought your videos were really engaging. Like I was hooked
Thank you.
right away. Yeah. So it was kind of sad to see that there were only four of them, but they coming from someone who puts out weekly videos, they take up a lot of time. Everything that goes into it takes up a lot. So I certainly understand, but um, I don't know the format of your videos. I enjoyed. So I think if you ever did make a comeback, that would be on YouTube. That would be
Yeah,
very cool.
yeah. The problem is I'm trying to keep up with the uh, indie publishing, you know, pressure of getting out as many books as possible, making sure they're quality, making sure they're marketed right, and then having time for YouTube. It's a struggle, but I did love making those videos, and they've been received fairly well. I think because I put so much time into them just to make sure that all the fat is trimmed and they're
Right.
entertaining, if not just informative.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, probably the last question I have for you here because we almost are at an hour, so I won't hold you here too
Oh,
long. But
time flies.
yeah, exactly. What what is your biggest piece of advice to aspiring writers, especially indie writers, because that's a whole different ball game to tackle there. So
It's tough. It's definitely tough. You have to have a diverse set of skills, and inevitably you'll come across a bump where your skills aren't enough, and then you need to learn more skills. But as for aspiring writers in general, um, writing is huge just for, like for your personal development. Being able to articulate your thoughts is such a potent thing, not just for like writing a story, but just in any like a work setting, being able to communicate your ideas. That's huge. So keep writing. I'd highly recommend starting with short stories, just because with something of a book's length, if you make one or two structuring errors, the whole work is kind of crippled. But with a short story, you can go back and edit and refine, and it's less of an investment, but you'll still get a good product at the end. And it doesn't even have to be a product, you know. Like I have a group of friends, and they just write short stories and share them to each other, and it's just fun.
Right. Yeah, the using short stories at first, I can definitely see how that would be beneficial. It's almost on a because they are different, obviously, from the longer stories as far as pacing, but um, yeah, structurally, I can definitely see how that would be very beneficial, especially when you're first starting for learning just how to plot things out from beginning to end. Sometimes when I would be plotting, it was you don't notice the plot holes or inconsistencies you have right away. So it takes a while to learn that too.
Yeah, and getting writing a scene in itself is difficult. Then writing a set of scenes is obviously even more difficult, but making them all cohere to like a central idea is extremely difficult with a book. But if you can practice that with a short story, that'll be extremely potent of a skill to have.
Hmm. Definitely. Well, that is really all the questions that I had for you today. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Um, it was great talking to you. I can't wait for that
Great talking to
third.
you as well.
Yeah, thank you. I can't wait for that third book. If you want to take a second to, I don't know, do any sort of plugs you want here, I'll put the links to your website and all that in the description for whenever this goes out. But if you want to take a second to do any of that, so
Awesome. Yeah. So regardless if I get back into YouTube or not, I do have a monthly newsletter where I kind of just talk about random thoughts, sometimes connected to fiction, other times whatever else I happen to be thinking about, and then I'll list my updates there. I'm fairly active on Facebook, so that's a good place to see my updates as well. My The first two books in the Wizard Slayer saga are both available in ebook and paperback on Amazon, so that's where you can get that. And book three should be coming out definitely in the next 2 months. So that's all I have.
okay. Well, I'm very excited to see that book three. So thank you again. I really appreciate your time today, and thank you everyone for watching. So I will see you next time.